All right, so one of the things that is a win for Tacoma is millennials. Now, I did a video that was talking about how Seattle is becoming pretty much unreachable for a lot of people because the costs are just so great that most people can't really afford a home there. Now, prices are going down, but when you look at the average price for a home, it's still pretty high. So, as a millennial, I'm not a millennial, by the way. Noel is more of a millennial. I'm not. I'm a little bit too old for it. But a lot of millennials are basically making the choice of leaving the city because it's just something that they cannot really afford. Now, many cities are trying to get as many millennials as possible because millennials represent a completely different demographic overall in that they want to move into cities. You know, a lot of other generations want to move out, but this is a generation that wants to move into cities. And so cities really want to have them because, for one, they bring a lot of energy to the format, right? If you look at a lot of the big companies that are around now and tech companies, a lot of those were started by millennials. So the concept is if you have millennials, you generate a lot more activity and buzz downtown, a lot more vibrancy. So a lot of cities are now, you don't have to agree with that, but a lot of cities are wanting that to happen. Seattle has become so expensive that it is losing a tremendous amount of millennials because they just can't afford it. When you look at the massive amount of college debt that millennials have, it makes sense. They can't afford to live in a city where rent is still pretty high and that they're never going to be able to afford a home. Most millennials won't be able to afford a home in Seattle. It's just not going to happen. Even if they do have really good jobs, you're still having to pay your student loan off, which has been tremendously expensive. I remember when I went to college, and this is going to not really date me. I mean, I'm 41, but when I went to college, the biggest student loan I pulled out was $5,000. The rest of it I basically worked and took care of. But 5 grand was the biggest I took out, and I was worried about that. You know what I mean? I was worried about it at the time. And I paid it off in no time, but I was worried at the time because I'm like, 5 grand, like, that's crazy. But now you have people who have 80,000, 100,000, 150,000 or more in student loans, and I could not even imagine that. So these folks are now in a pretty difficult situation because they're wanting to have a home and not constantly be in that threat. And I talk about this. Having homes or owning a home is the best way for most people to go because you have stability. When you have an apartment, you're basically at the risk of the economy. Because if the economy booms, then so does your rent, right? Once your contract is over, they can raise rents as high as they want. I own properties, so I can tell you that happens. So rents can go up at any point in time, and you are kind of stuck. You have to constantly fish around and find places where the rent is not so expensive. When you own a home, as long as you have a fixed rate, the only issues that you really have to worry about changing the price would be property tax. Or if your insurance for some reason goes up. But the biggest thing that's going to change your price will be property tax. So you're not at such a major disadvantage than if you were to have an apartment. You're just not as stable. So home ownership is probably one of the safest bets out there because it's an investment. Now, when you look at Tacoma, it actually has a higher amount of millennials moving to the city than than the national average. I forget the percentage, but it's higher than I think it's 8%. I don't know. but it's a pretty high average. And the reason for that is because if you look at surrounding cities, they don't really have a true downtown. They do, but not really. You know, it's kind of like a small, I mean, they're small cities, so it's not the same dynamicness that you're going to get, right? I mean, if you go to Federal Way, for example, it's nice, but downtown is pitiful. I mean, the only cities here that truly have a downtown where you can really, in my opinion, that you really and truly feel like, oh, cool, this is a city, you know, is Seattle, Bellevue, and Tacoma, in that order. And to a lesser degree, a far lesser degree, Everett and Olympia. Right? I mean, and really, when I say to a far lesser degree, I mean a very extreme lesser degree. They don't really have, when you look at their downtown, it looks like just any other small town really in America. You may see a few buildings that have a few stories to it, but it's not the same. So given the fact they can't afford Seattle, they're not going to afford Bellevue. I did a video talking about that. That leaves Tacoma in this area. So Tacoma, for a lot of millennials, is becoming a much more attractive option because I had mentioned all of the amenities that people look for. They're looking for the outdoors, right? They're looking for, I mean, you can go downtown on the waterfront and you can basically paddle, what is it called? Paddle boat? I don't know what it's called. You can do a lot of different things just on the waterfront downtown. You can go out to Point Defiance, which is the second largest city park in the country after Central Park in New York. So, urban park, that is. So, you have that. You have a theater district. You have a lot of the same things you have in Seattle, just not as much splash, and it's a whole lot cheaper. And so that is the reason why Tacoma is winning when it comes to millennials, because it's just a lot more affordable. Couple that with the fact that a lot of businesses up there are finding it even harder to, and I've said this many times, it's harder to compete with. Because you have so many, for one, it's expensive. So depending upon your location, it's going to pull your hair out. Even if you're a pretty well-financed company, it's going to be pretty expensive. Your salaries that you're going to have to pay are going to be pretty expensive as well. And so you have to do volume in order to survive. It's just a lot more obstacles there than it would be in any other place. Well, Bellevue as well is going to be pretty expensive. So that puts a big limit and a handicap on a lot of people. Some people still take that dive and go for it, but there's just so much competition. I was up there not long ago, and it's just constant. Some of the things here that are becoming saturated, though, are breweries. Breweries here, there's starting to be a little bit too many. To be honest with you, there's starting to be a little too many in downtown Tacoma, to be honest. There's just, there comes a saturation point of where people are going to say, well, what makes this brewery different than the next? That type of thing. But when it comes to Seattle, everything is saturated. Hold on one second. All right, I had to take a call. But everything is saturated. When you look at the restaurant scene in Seattle, it's just saturated. I mean, if you look at the coffee scene, if you look at any industry up there, it's just saturated. So you have to really stand out. I mean, the payoffs can be great, but it is really a competitive, super competitive city when it comes to everything. If you're looking for a job up there, it's really competitive. If you're looking for we're talking downtown specifically. Even though there are people who are great in tech, they have degrees in tech, it's still hard. It's harder to get a job there than some other places. So it's just a very competitive, and I tell people that, it's a very, very competitive city. It just is. If you are lucky to get a job there, then good on you. But when you go away from Seattle, it's not as competitive. And that goes for everything. That goes for getting a house. That goes for finding retail space for a business. That goes for restaurants. That goes for getting apartments. That goes for everything. It's not as competitive here as what you're going to find up there. So that's appealing to a lot of millennials in many respects because they want to be able to live in a city that's pretty vibrant, one that has a very decent downtown, one that has a decent nightlife, one that has all of the amenities that are appealing. And when you look at Tacoma, there are certain things that kind of aid that. And I keep talking about them because of the reason, and one of the reasons is because they're very significant. Now talk about how basically Tacoma does small things to kind of lure people from Seattle. And what they're doing is they're targeting certain groups of people, right? To be honest with you, they're targeting certain groups of people. Tacoma has always been known as I've always said it's a working man's city. They're going to always get folks that are just your working everyday average person. And we need those people. It also needs some of the, the executive type folks too that make a lot of money. We need those people as well. And then you need the middle class. You need a huge chunk of folks that do a lot of and I'm not saying the people who are working class are not middle class, they are. But you also need those folks that are in the middle here that work a lot of the professional end jobs and things like that. You need those folks too. So you need your accountants, you need your, mid-level managers, you need those people here as well. One of the missing elements is millennials, because a lot of those are the ones that will do a lot of the startups and different things. And so that slice is a highly coveted piece in every city in the country. And so things like the Tacoma Town Center satisfies the fact that you have a mall downtown. Because again, millennials typically are more downtown centered. So you have a mall downtown, right? You have a theater district downtown, which is great. You have a decent entertainment. It's developing. It's getting there downtown. We allow scooters. I know this sounds silly, but Tacoma allows scooters, whereas Seattle doesn't allow scooters. Like Lime has scooters, electric scooters, and so does Bird and all these others. They only allow e-bikes up in Seattle. Down here, we allow whatever, and you can use them on the sidewalk, wherever you want to use them. It's not a problem, but Seattle, you can't, right? So a lot of millennials are more apt to use a scooter by far than they will an e-bike. Now that sounds silly, but it's that freedom of saying, look, it's not a problem. Not a problem. Those types of things is what draws people here, because you have a little bit more freedom in many different aspects. So given the fact that now we are probably growing at a pretty good clip in terms of millennials, along with a lot of other groups of people, it makes the city a lot more attractive. So that is what's going to pull additional businesses here that target millennials specifically. And that's why you have some companies that are still waiting. And I said this before. There are some companies that are still waiting to come here. And by waiting, it either means that, A, they're waiting to find the right space. Many of them are wanting to focus on downtown because, again, chasing after the millennials, but also where a lot of the activity and tourists are. But they're waiting to find the right place. They're waiting for other projects to finish developing so that they can actually move in as well. They're waiting for a certain point in terms of just attracting residents. You have to have a certain percentage of people who live in an area to attract certain key businesses. And so they're waiting for those projects to finish, and they're looking at all of those, the analytics of that. It's because otherwise, a lot of times you can't even get investment money for that, right? So if I'm developing a project and I want to put a grocery store or a movie theater downtown, and I've done 30 of those as a company, but my investors say, well, let's look at the analytics because we want to see it. We know that Tacoma is a dynamic place, it's growing, But let's see what is down there. And if there's not a high enough percentage of people who live there, regardless of how many people come and work downtown, if there's not enough people who live downtown, it doesn't matter how many successful projects I have, you're not going to get an investment for it. They're going to say we're not going to do it. There has to be enough proof in the pudding. There has to be enough dedicated commitment down there for us to do it. And we're getting to that point in many different areas where now we're starting to grow downtown faster than we are in other places. It used to not always be the case. So millennials are buying homes definitely outside of downtown because there's not a lot of homes downtown. I mean, there are, but they can't afford them because they're in the stadium district, and Hilltop is now becoming pretty expensive. But you have a lot of them buy homes out in this area as well. I mean, I can point to 1, 2, 3, just looking out the front door. I know of 3 places, 4, where there are millennials. And I can kind of gauge that because I look at them and say, yeah, they're about Noelle's age or a little younger. But I know of 4 homes where millennials have bought in the last, since we've been here. And so that gives you an idea. One home, there's like several people that live there, but that home was for sale and they bought it. So there's like, I don't know, I think there's like 2 or 3 couples that live there in that home. There's a couple that just recently bought a home that's just right over there. One of the newest homes built, a black family bought that. You can tell they're young. They bought that last year. Brand spanking new home. It's 2-story. Then down the street, there's another crop of millennials that one of them owns, I know she owns a yoga studio. So that gives you an idea of just on this street. And if you count Noelle into that, then 5. But just on the street of people that I know or know of, gives you an idea. Actually, next to us is another millennial family. So 6. And that's all since we've been here and maybe a little bit before. Because the people next to us have been here a year before us. So it gives you an idea of how fast a neighborhood changed. This used to be a neighborhood of older people. Just a lot of older people. This home was owned by an older person. I know that for a fact. And so you're seeing that change. A couple of houses down, you see a lot of older people back towards that way. The closer you get to downtown, you start to see more and more younger people. But it just makes sense. The neighborhood is changing. Noelle and I talked about that, how the neighborhood is drastically changing. And as a result, the city is changing drastically because these are homes that are still pricey, but they're not like out of the reach for millennials like what you're going to see up in Seattle and other places. So anyhow, don't want to continue rambling, but yeah, this is another thing that kind of points to, now I don't think it's going to always be the case. I think that eventually there's going to come a point where houses here become out of the reach for a lot of millennials. But it doesn't surprise me that Tacoma is basically pretty high on the list for millennials due to the cost of living. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, I will see you. Take care.